Morning, everybody. Brett, are we ready to go? Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Is the mic working all right? Great. I'm happy to have you all here this morning. I am Reverend Carol Badeau. I am privileged to serve here as minister. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I want to extend a special welcome to those who are here with us online on our virtual service. We're glad to have you here. Thank you for showing up. Westside is a place where we strive to embody the values of what we represent when we light our chalice in a few minutes, which is truth, seeking light, clarity, vision, passion or warmth for justice and connection and community. And you are welcome here, whether you are here virtually, whether you are here for the first time, or whether you have been here for years and years. Today we're going to be talking about some history, some religious revivals. So get your bodies ready, because by the end we're going to be asking you to move. Okay? We have a few announcements. Get the business out of the way first. So, for any of you who might be interested, either if you're here already or you're out there watching us in YouTube land, you could come by later today. We have our Earth Church gathering this afternoon at 3 p.m. That is a gathering that I lead once a month where we gather outside because so many people connect with nature as their source of inspiration and comfort and a good place to engage in reflection. So we gather outside and we sit together in a circle and we just get to know each other for a little bit. Maybe I bring some kind of a centering or focusing theme or question based on the season, based on what's happening in nature. And then we spend 20 minutes, there's no sermon. This is church without a sermon. We spend 20 minutes where we each just take time in nature, sitting by the brook, sitting under a tree, wandering around the grounds. We just take time, and then we come back and share. So everyone is invited to that. You are welcome to join us. Also, Second Monday lunch will happen on September 12th at 11:30 at Olive Garden. That's a gathering where there's lots of food. So if you decide you want to participate in that, you can let the planners know in advance. Every week, we also have Wednesday and Thursday evening discussions, slightly different topics. Those are on Zoom. Wednesdays tends to be a little bit more intensely theological and philosophical, and Thursdays has a very wide range of topics. And another place, if you want to gather to just share thoughts with other people, is the book club. The book club is reading Useful Delusions, The Power and Paradox of the Self-Deceiving Brain by if you listen to NPR, Shankar Vedantam and Bill Messler. That's a book by them. That's the August book. They will be meeting Saturday, August 27th at 10 o'clock on Zoom. If you happen to be coming in person and you would like to volunteer as a greeter or a safety person, please let us know. We would love to have more people doing that. And a couple of save the dates. These aren't in your printed order of service. Okay, 2 fun things coming up. Our auction, October 15th, right, Ann? Saturday, October 15th, it'll be outside again this year. We have the big tents. Thank you to the Boy Scouts. And we will be gathering to have our auction celebration outside. We are talking about a theme, a justice-related auction. Some of you will remember that we talked about art and justice a couple of months ago. This is going to be the gallery showing, hopefully. So, start thinking about, do you do a craft? Do you do an art? Is there any form of artistic expression you might like to share with us that would be justice-related? The auction's going to be the big, the gallery opening for those. So you got a couple months to think about that, but I will be soliciting some of you directly soon. Okay, that's October 15th. Then if you are a person who likes to go to our retreat or is curious about our retreat at Pickett State Park, that's the second weekend in November. And we will be doing the usual puzzles and games and hikes and time outside. So if you're interested in that and you have questions, let me know. I'll be giving you more information about that in the coming weeks and months. Okay, does anybody have any other announcements that we need to remember? Fantastic. This is not in your order of service, but I'm doing it anyway. I'm going to go ahead and invite you to center yourselves. It is so easy to have our heads spinning and to be thinking about all the things that happened yesterday or this morning or that are about to happen when we get home. So it can be a useful practice to simply pause on the crest of that wave that is in constant motion. Take a deep breath. And just kind of call yourself into this moment in this place. Notice that you're sitting in a chair, in a body, in a room with other people. And for right now, for the next 40 or 45 minutes or so, maybe 50, you can just be present. This morning, we have some wonderful music. Yetta, would you like to explain could you explain a little bit about where this music comes from? Could you just give us a heads up about where this music comes from, please?
I'll be talking about the Second Awakening, and this music came out of the revival movement, and we'll be talking about shape note singing. I think that's what you mean.
It is, and also who are the old harp singers of East Tennessee? What is the Folkway Records? You've explained this to me. This is really cool.
Folkway Records is an organization, I guess, that archives historical music, and they are used for making documentaries, and they have old recordings of music that's really hard to find anymore. And the shape note tradition is something that will be part of what I'll be talking about later. And I'd like to apologize in advance for introducing some old-time banjo music that was going to also include fiddle, but Linda Phippen wasn't able to be with us, because that was actually not part of the tradition of revivals, I don't think, because some of the old-time Baptists believed that you should only use instruments that were mentioned in the Bible, in other words, your voice, and maybe a harp or so. So that's a little bit of...
Awesome.
Not anachronism, what's that? A historically inaccurate part of the service.
Okay, great. So we're going to be playing in the service a couple of pieces that are from these archived records that are, this is the old harp singers of East Tennessee actually singing Amazing Grace, and it's shape note singing. wonderful. We begin our services with the lighting of the chalice that is representative of who we are. Today, our chalice lighting words come from Quill and Shin, who, if you were at our, maybe a year ago, we had another service about revivals, and we learned that Quill and Shin was a universalist circuit rider, which is really important to these revivals. Here's what he said: sentiment lies at the back of all achievement. It is the dynamite that stimulates to noble endeavor and glorious action. This isn't the sort of thing we usually say for our chalice lighting. So, what we're going to do today is I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background of the sorts of things that Yetta is going to be talking about, and the setting for the kind of music that we just heard. And Quill and Shin is part of a movement, and there were a series of these between the 18th and the 19th, or late, let's see. There was one in the 18th, one in the middle of the 19th, and one in the late 19th century, these revival movements, okay? And one of the core messages of revival is sentiment, feeling it. I am looking at you all right now. I'm not seeing a lot of feeling it. So I'm kind of hoping that by the time we're done, sentiment will be at the back and the front and the middle, stimulating you all to noble endeavor and glorious action. It is part of our Unitarian Universalist history, actually, that the Unitarians tend to be the intellectuals and the Universalists tend to be the passionate, fervent ones. So this is a little bit of background history about that. So if you were here last week, you know that we talked about the native history of Tennessee. We went on a little tour of what we call prehistory. I've got some questions about that as a political term, because lots of things were happening in prehistory. There were lots of people who were keeping their own history. We talk about that time period often as prehistory, but I'm going to call it the native history. We focused on the tribes and the peoples who were here for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. This week, we're going to talk about a little bit about the European settlers and their culture. We can only get one little window into that, really, in such a short time. But we're going to talk about the settlers who came into the mountains that separated the eastern coast and the foothills on the eastern side of the mountains from what was the frontier, right? We live in the frontier at the earliest time, from that earliest time period. We now call it Tennessee. And also broadly, the greater region that we know as Appalachia. I'm going to give you a little bit of background history on a set of cultural and religious revivals that shaped and then revealed the sort of qualities of life on the frontier that would have influence in broader society. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, the frontier was, by European standards, when they said, what's the frontier over there? And even the people who lived on the coast said this, what's the frontier? The frontier was pretty much land that was not settled by white people. So you can imagine that as white people settled westward, the frontier, what we defined as the frontier, moved. It got pushed backward, okay? So in the earliest days, the frontier was kind of everywhere. Like if you landed on the coast, it was there, you were in the frontier, you were in that land. But by the mid to late 18th century, the frontier had moved westward far enough that it was the hills and valleys of what we now think of as Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio. People were, Daniel Boone and the like, we're going over the hills and starting to try to settle into this frontier territory. When Europeans first arrived in the so-called New World, of course, that was scary. Like, this was intimidating. And religion was a main source of comfort and direction and guidance and social order. It provided structure. as time passed and things happened, right? Wars were fought, the nation was founded, and people moved further west. And the lands further west became defined as the scary frontier, or the exciting frontier, or the adventurous frontier, right? With each shift, though, in culture and society during those early decades, religious gatherings and the way religion responded to the movement westward, to the changes in politics, to the changes in governance. Religious structures have a way of revealing sort of the core questions and passions that were driving people in society. So, one window that historians and people who study culture look at this through in this time period is the religious revival movements. So we're not going to talk about the Third Great Awakening because it's after the time we're talking about. There were two Great Awakenings that happened between the 1730s and the 1830s, roughly. These are rough figures. And they give us lots of clues into what was happening in America, and they also were a strong force for shaping things. So in the 1730s and 1740s, now remember, we've talked about there were native people, the older native people, the older cultures were killed off by diseases that De Soto and other people brought in the 1500s. Europeans from France and England started coming really and starting to settle in the 1600s. By the 1730s and 1740s, we're having wars with the native tribes who have taken the place of those previous tribes. There's a lot of tension between European powers fighting for the land. The French and the English they're really fighting. We call these wars, these early wars, the French and Indian Wars, but they were really the French and the British wars where they got the Indians to ally with the two of them. So there's these wars. At that time, there arose the First Great Awakening. It was a big religious revival that established some key qualities that were influential in the revolution. These qualities included a sort of evangelical passion and fervor, enthusiasm, in this case religious enthusiasm, and a description, this is really interesting, of salvation as attainable for anyone through intense piety. Okay? It was a strongly Calvinist movement, but it changed a key concept of Calvinism. I know that we're not all students of Calvinism. Calvinism said you only get to go to heaven if you were already chosen before you were born and you got no say in it and nothing you do matters. End of conversation. The revival came through and said, okay, no. If you're pious enough, you can be saved, all right? This had a huge impact on a nation establishing its own independence and asserting its autonomy, okay? Jonathan Edwards, who is one of the main voices of this First Great Awakening, gives us a famous example of the revival's mood and tenor. In his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, how many of you had to read this in high school or college? Anybody besides me? Sinners in the hands of an angry God. He described humans as dangling like spiders precariously over the fiery pits of hell, waiting at the tension of just a spider's web thread to be dropped. So fear was a primary motivator in the first revival. And some important enemies of the revivalists were the Unitarians, the deists like Thomas Jefferson, the heretics who supported universalism, and other Enlightenment thinkers. The unique thing about this movement was that while it was still Calvinist and conservative by our standards, it radically asserted equality and democracy. It said anyone could achieve salvation if you were just zealous enough and fervent enough and you tried hard enough. Does this sound like anything that carried through in American culture? Doesn't that sound consistent, right? And this democratic mood really did help fuel the revolution. Another very powerful Great Awakening preacher, whose name was George Whitefield, he was particularly democratic in that he preached to common people, not just people with money. He preached to slaves. He preached to native people and demonstrated this democratic feeling to the movement. Even Benjamin Franklin became a good friend of Whitfield's. And Patrick Henry, anybody know Patrick Henry's most famous line? Give me liberty or give me death. So Patrick Henry, those very words, his work was actually influenced by a revivalist preacher from the First Great Awakening named Samuel Davies. Patrick Henry's mother was part of Samuel Davies' following, and Patrick Henry, who was really supposed to be hanging out in Williamsburg at Bruton Parish Church, Davies attended, Henry, who attended Bruton Parish, Henry went sometimes with his mom to hear Samuel Davies preach, and got that little bit of that revival spirit you can actually trace in Patrick Henry's speeches and letters, the voice of Samuel Davies' sermons. So there was this influence going on, this sort of anti-institutionalism. You don't have to be part of the big church that we pay taxes to. You can be part of this frontier movement, and anybody can be saved. So there was a lot of fuel there. After the Revolution, after the United States became its own nation, a second Great Awakening started to arise. And this one really started in the 1790s in Kentucky and here in Tennessee. As more and more folks, now imagine we've established the nation, and now we have control. Now we have supposedly control of these lands in the frontier. So after the Revolution, lots and lots of people moved over the top of the mountains into this area. As a matter of fact, many of you have heard me talk about my partner Tracy, his family. His 5 times great-grandpa, Henry Bohannon, received a piece of land in Gatlinburg, in that area, as his reward, as his allotment for being a Revolutionary War soldier, and came over the mountain and settled there. This is a very common scenario. So people moved. Now, still riding that wave of democratic spirit, this second revival that arose was full of passion, and it was full of passionate preachers who were traveling out amongst the people. They were riding mile after mile to bring the message out onto the frontier, and they had this enthusiasm. This one was a little bit different, though, because this one really got the sentiment going. People were falling down with the spirit, and they were shaking and quaking, and they were really passionate about transforming things. There was a key difference. This revival, whereas the previous one had focused on piety as the path to making things happen the way you wanted to, the second revival really focused on free will. There was some elements of free will in the first revival, but by the second revival, it was really about free will. As citizens of a newly independent nation, these Americans were excited about building a society, curing the ills of the society around them that they saw, establishing movements and institutions that would be transformative. So these revivals often addressed broader social issues like slavery, temperance, suffrage, okay? And this is really the rise of these kinds of grassroots religions addressing broader society. It brought all sorts of cultural and spiritual and artistic and political revivals and movements sweeping across the nation. So, what Yetta's going to be talking about in a few minutes is some of the effects of that revival in culture here, okay? Famous revivalist Charles Grandison Finney said this: where there is a spirit of controversy in the church or in the land, I'm going to repeat that. Where there is a spirit, see if it applies to today. Where there is a spirit of controversy in the church or in the land, a revival is needful. So just keep that in mind, bear that in mind. What is it about revival that might be reviving to us. In a few minutes, Yetta is going to be telling us about some of the qualities of art and culture that happened here in our own backyard. So, one of the things we do here is we try to be agents of revivals of different sorts. We try to be agents of social transformation, of positive change, and of awakening. We try to do that. One of the ways we do that is by supporting this institution, which in turn supports other institutions and supports individuals doing those things. So in a minute, we're going to be taking an offering to support the church and support the communities that we support through our work. Yetta is going to bravely, without her compadre, Linda, who's unable to be with us today, Yetta is going to play. I cannot wait to hear the banjo. The banjo. Yetta's going to play the banjo for us while the offering is collected.
I pray for forgiveness for any musical sins I might commit in advance.
So much. That was awesome. Jerry Thornton's going to share a reading from Mark Twain.
Gotta take this off so my glasses don't fog up. Now this is from Tom Sawyer. Then came the measles. During 2 long weeks, Tom lay a prisoner, dead to the world and its happenings. He was very ill. He was interested in nothing. When he got upon his feet at last and moved feebly downtown, a melancholy change had come over everything and every creature. There had been a revival, and everybody had got religion. Not only the adults, but even the boys and girls. Tom went about, hoping against hope for the sight of one blessed sinful face. But disappointment crossed him everywhere. He found Joe Harper studying a testament and turned sadly away from the depressing spectacle. He sought Ben Rogers and found him visiting the poor with a basket of tracts. He hunted up Jim Hollis, who called his attention to the precious blessings of his late measles as a warning. Every boy he encountered added another ton to his depression. And when, in desperation, he flew for refuge at last to the bosom of Huckleberry Finn and was received with a scriptural quotation, his heart broke, and he crept home and to bed, realizing that he alone of all the town was lost forever and forever.
Thank you, Jerry. So I guess Tom Sawyer missed the great revival that came through. I'm going to be talking about the Second Great Awakening. This is where the settlers moved west, as Reverend Carroll described, to get away from the religious intolerance in the East. And they actually had to pay taxes to support other denominations that were state religions, like the Episcopalians in, I think it was Virginia, right? And so a common heresy that they shared, as she mentioned, was the idea that anyone could seek salvation and that they had free will. The first to arrive here in Tennessee were the Baptists and the Methodists. But before there were any churches actually on the frontier, there were itinerant preachers that traveled a circuit. And the circuits were pretty long. They were around 200 miles in circumference. So the congregation, it wasn't really a congregation, but little communities would have the circuit preacher come through on horseback maybe once every 4 weeks or so, and that's how often they would meet. And they might have Sunday school in between. So one very famous circuit riding preacher was a Methodist bishop named Francis Asbury, and you'll see signs of him around because there are roads, there are trails in the Smokies where he went through, and there are also historical markers. And he was actually not that great of a preacher, according to records, but he was very ecumenical and accepted everyone, all races. He traveled with a former slave, Harry Hosier, and he also preached to all races, and he later ordained Richard Allen, who went on to found the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So he was very influential in bringing these evangelical religions to the African American community and former slaves. So these were held, they had camp meetings that were held after the harvest when farmers were available to come to them. They were held at night at the light of the full moon in isolated mountain communities in Appalachia, like in Cades Cove. There's a great book about Cades Cove if you ever want to read and learn more about the history of religion in these, isolated mountain communities. So some people would walk like 25 miles to go to these camp meetings on a Friday, and they would come back on Monday. And there were also people that had wagons, and those would have large families. They'd all be bundled up onto the wagon, all their tents and everything that they were going to need for the weekend. And they might come from 30 to 50 miles away. They were an opportunity for young people, maybe one of the few opportunities for young people to meet each other, and so there was a lot of courting going on. And as one person quipped, more souls were made than saved at camp meetings. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the idea of salvation and the jerks. So you've walked to the meeting. The preacher's calling you up to what they called the mourner's bench up here, to repent. He's reminding you of all your sins and wants you to receive God's grace. And you're not alone. Around you, there are people of all colors, genders, and denominations being exhorted to repent and receive Jesus Christ. Day and night, this would go on in more than one tent, and there'd be more than one preacher sometimes. So maybe you found yourself moved by the Spirit, and maybe you were even struck down to the ground while listening to a powerful sermon. This is a first-hand account by Reverend John Brooks. The stoutest of men instantly fall as dead men to the ground and lay motionless and seemingly breathless for hours. Others would be so struck with a sense of their sinful state they would commence crying aloud for mercy, while their countenances would express a dreadful expectation of God's immediate displeasure and wrath. They would roll and tumble and scream for mercy. The awful agony into which they would get before their deliverance But then all of a sudden, as quick as thought, their countenances would change, and his tongue would cry, "Why, bless the Lord, salvation to the God, glory, glory." And while his countenance fully evinced that he was a new creature in Christ Jesus. So those afflicted by these symptoms, these physical symptoms, came to be called the jerks for obvious reasons. Did you know that the first recorded outbreak of the jerks happened right down the road in Maryville at the New Providence Presbyterian Church in the summer of 1803? So this jerking phenomenon seemed to be contagious, and also you have to keep in mind that there were ruffians on the outskirts of these camp meetings because they were also, there to see what was going on, and there would be some commerce going on. So people began to argue about whether salvation experienced by the jerks were authentic, and after a while the preachers started to dissuade or discourage them. So at the end of the night, when all this preaching has gone on and you've had people come up to the mourner's bench and jerk around or whatever they did and be saved, they would go around to each tent and they would count up how many souls had been saved, and that was a measure of the meeting's success. And there was also singing at the camp meetings. Imagine you've been put in charge of the hymns and leading them. You look out over the sea of faces. You see Methodists over there, and you see the Baptists, and you're thinking, well, what would they both know? And there's some Presbyterians in the middle here. There's an odd Universalist over here, and a few unchurched heathens in the corner. There are no hymnals. What would they all know? Even if they had hymnals, most of them can't read printed words, let alone music. And anyway, it's getting dark, so what can you do? Well, they all know old folk songs. How about we turn them into hymns by adding religious words? Those original lyrics are pretty ribald, so you have to hope that no one will accidentally slip into the old version. But then you can line out the song, you sing each line alone, and then it's echoed by all the singers. So that's what happened. According to one account, the hymns were started by an excited leader during the preacher and then taken up by the throng until the meeting was dissolved into a singing ecstasy. This call and response style slowed things down enough to create room for the more talented or more experienced singers or adventurous singers to improvise. And the whole was greater than the sum of its parts because of that diversity. According to Ellen Jane Lorenz, Negro spirituals have their African flavor and the white spirituals have their British origins, but the camp meeting choruses flowered spontaneously in the unplowed soil of the American frontier. Another option you might try is shape note singing. Shape note hymns have 4-part harmony, and the different shapes allow singers to be able to find their notes without knowing how to read music. Harp singing was taught at singing schools, and that you might have that as a vocation would be to sing harp singing. For example, in Cades Cove, there was a school, and elsewhere in the area. Have any of you ever traveled or hiked to the Walker Sisters cabin in the school there? It's a very short hike. If you have a chance, you should go. It's quite nice, and it has a lot of historical features. So later in the 1800s and early 1900s, the Walker Sisters were still practicing harp singing at that school. And be warned that harp singing is not a spectator sport. As one singer said, "I'd walk 1,000 miles to sing this music, but I wouldn't cross the street to hear it. In fact, I think you might walk the other way." Well, you can judge for yourselves in a few minutes.
So are we going to get a chance to try to try to move to some harp singing, some of this kind of singing, with our What Wondrous Love?
Yes, we're going to listen to some.
So we're going to listen to some. But are we going to move while we listen to it?
You can.
Can you? This is impromptu. I'm putting Yetta on the spot right now. Yetta, can you show us, you've done the shape note kind of conducting before, right? Could you show us what that looks like, please? Like, give us a little demo. This is super cool. You guys have seen Yetta doing this and you don't know what it is. Okay, so what does it look like?
So we have sung this here before, and basically the harmony in shape note singing is a little different. They're like fifths apart rather than just what most people do, it's thirds. And they'll stand in a square sometimes. I mean, not always, but there'll be 4 parts, and people with the different parts will stand facing each other. And the leader will go like, they take turns leading, and it's very democratic, and the leader will keep the beat by going like this. And I'll be honest with you, I find that very helpful to me. So I will try to do that.
Versus the European conductor's version, which looks very
Right.
different, right? So, okay, now, this is where we're going to try to get a little revival. All right, you don't have to stand up, but just imagine yourself at a revival, all right? As Brad is going to play What Wondrous Love Is This by the, what is the group called? The Old East?
The East Tennessee harp singing.
Okay, we're going to read it right. Here, let's get it right. Old Harp Singers of East Tennessee.
Okay.
Okay? They are singing What Wondrous Love Is This. Now, what you got to imagine is that you got such a fire in your belly and such spirit in your soul going on that instead of being like, well, that's nice and historical and fascinating, how lovely, and recording it in that part of your brain, you are stirred to passion by it. You're like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling it. Because Yetta, when Yetta conducts this, is very respectful. But I got to imagine some of these people are like really feeling it. So let's just use our imaginations as Brad plays What Wondrous Love Is This for us. Deep in you.
That was quite a workout for my arm.
You've got to imagine that they really were like when people were in these revivals, if they were singing a slow song like that rather than being the kind of fervent jerking kind of experience, you'd be having this really deep, intense, oh, what wondrous love is this. I can imagine the preacher in this setting.
But there are faster versions.
There are faster versions.
And I wanted to explain that they start out by singing do, re, mi instead of singing the words.
Judy, what's
They're
it?
all holding a piece of paper with shape notes on it that they were following.
Yes, and actually I should have brought it, but Ellen lent me her shape note. What is it called? The sacred, there's a certain, Sacred Heart of Columbia is the one that she has. Yeah, and you can actually do this if you go to the Laurel Theater. There's still a group there that does harp singing, and I'm sure there are other groups in Maryville and in the surrounding areas.
Awesome. So next time you happen to brave the drive through Cades Cove, imagine if you can, people whose experience was like this. People would walk for days to come to church. They would walk for days to come to church. So, as we close out our service today, I want you to take a minute and ask yourself, have I ever felt revival? We have different things that stir us to passion. As Quillen Shin said, sentiment is at the back of all great action, right? So what has stirred your soul? What has stirred you to the point where you might, I've seen some of you give a emphatic talk and jerk around a little bit. I've witnessed that, right? What is it that stirs you to that level of revival? We're going to be extinguishing our chalice in a minute. It is meant to be a reminder of that kind of passion, that spirit of light and that brightness that can get sparked in us. In those days it was, I know there was some other kinds of sparking going on at the revivals, but it can get sparked by someone saying something passionately to us. It can get sparked by music. When you leave this place, we hope that that spark goes with you, the light of truth or seeking for truth, the warmth of community, and the comfort of being together, but also the encouragement, the inspiration, and sometimes a little bit of new information that goes with coming together. So we invite you to carry that with you as we extinguish the chalice and go into our day and our week. Go in peace. Love is this, oh my soul, oh my soul.